Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. February 23, 1778. The road into camp was frozen mud, rutted by wagon wheels and streaked with something worse. Soldiers without shoes had wrapped their feet in rags soaked stiff with old blood. Smoke from 1,000 crude huts hung low over the hills, and under it, men were dying, not in battle, but in their own filth, from typhus and dysentery and simple starvation, at a rate of 2 or 3 a day.
Into this scene rode a stranger. He wore a star-shaped medal the size of a fist, a fur-trimmed cloak, and an expression of total, unshakable confidence. Beside his horse trotted an Italian greyhound named Asa. He announced himself, through an interpreter, as Lieutenant General Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben of the Prussian army. He was lying. He'd never held a rank higher than captain in his life, and in parts of Europe, he wasn't a baron so much as a man one step ahead of a warrant for his arrest. So how does a fraud, a foreign adventurer with an invented title and a fabricated resume, walk into the worst winter of the American Revolution and, in a matter of weeks, turn a starving, half-armed militia into the force that would stand toe-to-toe with the British Army and not break? That's the story. By the winter of 1777, the American Revolution was not going well. Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress, the largest city in the 13 colonies, had fallen to the British in September. General George Washington's army had been beaten twice in 6 weeks, first at Brandywine, then at Germantown, both times outmaneuvered by regulars who drilled, marched, and fought as a single coordinated machine. The Continental Army did not. It was a patchwork of state militias, each trained, if trained at all, from a different manual, sometimes British, sometimes French, sometimes nothing but instinct and stubbornness. Commands given in one regiment meant nothing in the next. Congress had no money. The army had no coats. And as the last leaves came down, Washington marched roughly 12,000 men into winter quarters at a forested ridge above the Schuylkill River called Valley Forge, less to rest them than to keep what was left of them alive. This is the army Steuben rode into. To understand why he was the man who could fix it, you have to go back, decades back, to Prussia, and to a war that taught an entire generation of European officers that discipline wasn't a virtue. It was a weapon. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben was born in Magdeburg in 1730, the son of a Prussian army engineer, and he grew up moving from garrison to garrison the way other children moved between neighborhoods. He commissioned into the Prussian infantry at 17 and spent the 7 Years' War fighting under Frederick the Great. Steuben was wounded twice. He was captured once. And by the war's final years, he'd earned something rarer than a battlefield medal, a staff posting close to Frederick's own headquarters, where he watched, up close, how the Prussian machine actually worked. In 1763, Steuben was let go from the Prussian army during post-war downsizing, common enough. But the fall that followed was not. He took a court position in the tiny principality of Hohenzollern-Hechingen, and within a few years, he was quietly forced out amid accusations. By the mid-1770s, Steuben was in his mid-40s, unemployed, in debt, and functionally unemployable anywhere in Europe that valued its reputation. Which is how, in 1777, a nearly bankrupt former Prussian captain ended up in Paris, in the office of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin and his fellow American Commissioner Silas Deane were desperate for European officers. The unemployed captain became a lieutenant general. The disgraced courtier became a baron of unimpeachable standing. Franklin wrote the letters. Deane signed off on them. He landed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in December, and reached Valley Forge 2 months later, in the depths of that catastrophic winter, to make good on a lie in front of the one army in the world that couldn't afford to be lied to. Steuben didn't ease into the job. He didn't hide behind rank. He picked a single model company of about 100 men and started drilling them himself, personally, at dawn, in a fenced field near headquarters, teaching the same movement over and over until it was reflex. His aides, a young former British officer named Benjamin Walker, and a French volunteer named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, translated his instructions from French and German, phrase by phrase, while Steuben mimed and marched and physically pushed men's shoulders and rifles into position himself. When soldiers got it wrong, and at first, they got it wrong constantly, Steuben would explode into a torrent of profanity in 3 languages at once, then, mid-curse, start laughing at his own fury, because he genuinely seemed to enjoy the men more than he despised their mistakes. He simplified everything. He standardized the manual of arms across the entire army. He taught bayonet drill for the first time in any organized way the Continental Army had seen. He reorganized the camp itself, latrines dug downhill and away from the water supply, kitchens separated from waste. By April, the single model company had become the whole army's teaching cadre. He put the entire system into writing, dictating in French while aides translated it into English, producing what would become known as the Blue Book. Now, pay close attention to this next detail, because it's the piece that explains everything that follows. So if you're new here, this is a good moment to subscribe, because the next section is where the training gets tested against real British bayonets. Because in the spring of 1778, everything changed strategically. France finally signed a formal alliance with the rebels. British commander Sir Henry Clinton made the call, abandoned Philadelphia, marched the army back overland to the safety of New York. On June 18, 1778, roughly 10,000 British and Hessian troops, dragging a baggage train some 12 miles long, began the march north out of Philadelphia across the sweltering plains of New Jersey. Washington saw his opening immediately. He sent roughly 5,000 troops under General Charles Lee to strike the British rearguard near a crossroads called Monmouth Courthouse, with the main army following close behind. Picture the scene on the morning of June 28, 1778. Temperatures already climbing past 90 degrees before 10 a.m. Lee's advance force, units under Anthony Wayne, the Marquis de Lafayette, and William Alexander, moved on the British rearguard near the courthouse village around 10 in the morning. And then, faced with a stronger-than-expected British counter-response led personally by Lord Cornwallis, Lee did something almost no one expected. He ordered a retreat. The retreat, without clear coordination, began to unravel, units peeling back through the heat and dust in confusion, with no one entirely sure who was falling back on whose orders. And then Washington arrived. Riding up from the main column and finding his advance force streaming backward instead of pressing the attack, Washington rode directly into the confusion, and did something that, 1 year earlier, would have been unthinkable. He personally rallied the retreating troops. And they formed. That's the payoff of the whole winter at Valley Forge, arriving in real time, under a 100-degree sun. Regiments that had never drilled the same way now executed the same commands. Nathaniel Greene's division swung artillery onto high ground. Lord Stirling anchored the left. Wayne's troops, dug in near a hedgerow, traded volleys. It was the heat, almost as much as the muskets, that killed men that day. Soldiers on both sides dropped from heat stroke in their wool coats. Somewhere in the chaos near a cannon position, a woman is said to have carried water to overheated gun crews and, when her husband collapsed, taken his place loading the cannon herself. By nightfall, the British had disengaged and slipped quietly away under cover of darkness, continuing their march to New York unimpeded. The numbers, when the dust and heat cleared, the Continental Army suffered roughly 72 killed in action. British losses ran higher. Estimates range from around 300 to over 350 killed, wounded, and missing. Monmouth was effectively the last major set-piece battle in the northern theater of the war. Steuben's Blue Book, refined and expanded, would go on to govern American military drill for decades. Congress formally appointed Steuben Inspector General of the Continental Army. Baron von Steuben stayed with the Continental Army through the rest of the war, serving with distinction at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. He never married, never fully shed the whispers that had chased him out of Europe, and died in 1794, largely in debt. Charles Lee's story ends far less kindly. Court-martialed after Monmouth, he died in a Philadelphia boarding house in 1782, largely estranged from the cause he'd fought. Benjamin Walker went on to serve on Washington's own staff. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant would go on to design the street layout of the young nation's new capital city. Mary Ludwig Hayes lived into her 70s, buried, decades later, with military honors. The whole thing turns on one quiet irony. An army built to fight for the truth of a revolutionary idea was saved, in its darkest winter, by a man who had lied his way into the job. Today, if you visit Valley Forge, the fields where Steuben drilled his 100 men are quiet and mowed and green, dotted with historical markers instead of frozen mud and typhus. There's a statue of him there now.